April 15th, 1945. The gates of Bergen Belsen swung open, not with gunfire or resistance, but with silence. A negotiated surrender, agreed upon days earlier by Heinrich Himmler, handed the camp to the British without a shot fired. But what waited inside would scar the conscience of the world. More than 13,000 corpses littered the earth, unburied. Another 60,000 prisoners, skeletal and dying, stumbled through a living hell. Typhus, dysentery, starvation. Death had claimed dominion here, not through bullets or gas, but neglect. Deliberate, systematic neglect. British soldiers, hardened by years of combat, wept openly. One officer wrote, "This was not war. This was the absence of civilization itself." And among the chaos they saw something they hadn't expected. SS guards. Not fleeing but waiting, calm, composed. Among them were Irma Grace, Elizabeth Folkenrath, and Johanna Bormann. 3 women, 3 architects of pain. They did not hide, they did not deny. They claimed to be maintaining order, but survivors pointed fingers, some trembling, some screaming. "She beat my sister to death. She sent children to die." And as British officers stepped over piles of the dead, they knew justice must come. Bergen Belsen was never meant to kill on this scale. Originally a prisoner of war camp in 1940, it evolved into a hybrid horror. By 1945, with Auschwitz evacuated, it became a dumping ground for the dying. With no gas chambers, Belsen found other means: starvation, untreated disease, crowding. One survivor later recalled, "You could not tell the living from the dead. You learned not to step too hard, because you might crush someone still breathing." In this bleak architecture of abandonment, death was not an accident. It was policy. And amidst it all, the women in black uniforms issued commands, lashes, selections. The British were unprepared for what they found, but they acted swiftly. They ordered mass burials, burned the barracks, quarantined the infected, and most notably, arrested the guards. What followed would reshape justice, redefine evil, and expose a truth the world struggled to comprehend, that the face of atrocity was not always male, and not always monstrous. Sometimes it smiled, sometimes it was young, sometimes it was ordinary. This is the story of what really happened to the female guards of Bergen Belsen. They were not born monsters. Irma Grace was just a farm girl from Recken. She lost her mother to suicide at 13 after discovering her father's infidelity. That loss, combined with the collapse of Germany's soul after World War I, left a wound wide enough for ideology to enter. By 15, she'd quit school. By 18, she wore the black and silver of the SS. Elizabeth Folkenrath, once a nanny and hairdresser, was drawn not by violence, but by order. The Nazi promise of national pride, of purpose, called to her in the chaos of the 1930s. In 1941, she joined the female SS, Auxiliary Corps, voluntarily. Her path was not forced. And Johanna Bormann? At 45, she was older, different, once religious, even interested in missionary work. But when money ran short, she took a civilian job in a concentration camp kitchen. By the time she transferred to Ravensbrück, her soul had shifted. These were not coerced conscripts. They applied, trained, and climbed. By 1943, the 3 women met in the shadow of Auschwitz-Birkenau. There, they became something else. Irma, promoted quickly, was nicknamed the Beautiful Beast. Her blue eyes and neat braid masked cruelty. Prisoners recalled her dog, trained to maim on command, her whip, her selection of inmates, especially attractive women, for death. Some whispered she smiled while doing it. Elizabeth managed the women's barracks. She invented punishments, ordered beatings, controlled food parcels. Once, a prisoner was accused of hiding a ring. Elizabeth forced her to run beside a bike while being beaten, then locked her in a dark cell for days. Johanna, the weasel of Auschwitz, used her own dog as a weapon. One survivor described being dragged by the hair while Johanna laughed, watching the dog tear flesh. As the Red Army approached in 1945, the 3 women were transferred to Bergen Belsen. The camp was in collapse, 60,000 crammed into space meant for 10,000. Epidemics surged, food vanished, but the guards did not change. Irma still used her pistol, Elizabeth still beat women unconscious, Johanna still walked with her dog through the dying. They could have fled. Many did. But they stayed. Some say it was arrogance, others say it was delusion. Perhaps they thought their crimes would be buried beneath the corpses. But the Allies were coming, and the women's time was almost up. April 15th, 1945. The trucks rumbled through the gates of Bergen Belsen. What the British soldiers saw stopped them cold. The ground writhed, not with life, but with suffering. Human figures barely recognizable. Emaciated bodies with hollow eyes stared back, too weak to stand, too numb to scream. Among them, corpses lay everywhere, on paths, in barracks, under trees, over 13,000 dead, and no one left to bury them. Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin later wrote in his diary, "There were no cries of joy, no celebrations, only eyes filled with unbearable silence. No one had the strength to hope anymore." The stench, rotting flesh, human waste, disease, burned the lungs. Soldiers vomited behind supply trucks, others fell to their knees. And then came the surreal discovery. Amid this horror, the SS guards were still present, unfleeing. Among them stood Irma Grese, her hair neatly braided. Elizabeth Folkenrath, arms folded as if inspecting barracks. Johanna Bormann, silent, her dog close by. They claimed they'd stayed to maintain order, but survivors recognized them instantly. One woman whispered, "That's her. She made my sister hold up a potato for hours, then beat her when she dropped it." The British didn't hesitate. They arrested the guards. And then they ordered them to work. For days, the SS men and women alike were forced to bury the bodies. British troops watched over them with rifles drawn. Irma hauled corpses in a wheelbarrow. Elizabeth vomited beside a mass grave. Johanna, eyes blank, dragged limbs through the mud. It was not revenge. It was justice. Raw, immediate, and undeniable. Survivors watched, some weeping, others stone-faced. A former inmate named Malka, age 17, later said, "I saw Irma carry a body. For the first time, she looked human, not in strength, but in weakness." But not all prisoners lived to witness this reckoning. Even after liberation, hundreds died each day from typhus, dysentery, starvation. The British had arrived, but for many it was too late. One nurse recalled holding a child no heavier than a pillow, her skin translucent. The girl smiled, whispered, "Thank you," and slipped away. No bullets fell at Belsen, but it became a battlefield nonetheless, a war between life and the memory of death. And at its center stood three women, silent, grim, finally stripped of uniform and power. But was that enough? The trials were coming, and the world was watching. September 17th, 1945. In the small German town of Lüneburg, Justice sat in a wooden chair and wore a British uniform. The Belsen trial had begun. 45 former guards and officials stood accused of crimes committed at Bergen Belsen and Auschwitz. Among them were Irma Grese, Elizabeth Folkenrath, and Johanna Bormann, three women whose names had become synonymous with cruelty. The courtroom smelled of fresh timber and old sweat. Reporters packed the benches. Survivors filled the back rows, their faces pale, their hands trembling as memories were summoned. The British tribunal, led by Major General H.P.M. Bernie Ficklin, played film reels from the liberation, mass graves, skeletal survivors, the SS burying the dead. The images stunned the room into silence. When Irma Grese took the stand, she sat with poise. Just 22 years old, she wore a crisp blouse and stared straight ahead. She admitted to beating prisoners, yes, but denied ever sending anyone to die. "I was following orders," she said, but survivors disagreed. Ilona Stein testified, "I saw Irma shoot a woman near the fence just because she stood too long." Witnesses described Grese's whip, her German shepherd, her fondness for tormenting the sick, and always the smile. Elizabeth Folkenrath claimed she didn't know about the gas chambers, that she only handled administrative duties, but survivors told of her relentless beatings, her cold silence as prisoners collapsed. Johanna Bormann blamed age and circumstance, said her dog was just a pet, but the courtroom heard otherwise. Alexandra Sawita recalled being mauled during a forced march. Johanna watched. She did nothing. Over 50. Witnesses spoke. Some cried. Some could not finish. But all remembered. The judges took no pleasure in their verdicts. On November 16th, they announced their decisions. Grace Falkenrath and Bormann, guilty. Sentenced to death by hanging. No applause followed, no cheers, only stillness. A British soldier later wrote, "I watched Irma Gries receive her sentence. She did not blink. It was as if she had prepared for this ending long before." In the days that followed, appeals were filed, denials continued, but justice had spoken. The system that trained them, molded them, rewarded them, was gone. Now, all that remained were ashes and memory. December 13th, 1945, Hamelin Prison. Before dawn broke over the snow-dusted rooftops of Lower Saxony, the executioner prepared his ropes. 11 condemned waited in silence. 3 of them were women. Irma Gries, Elizabeth Falkenrath, and Johanna Bormann had spent the night in separate cells. British hangman Albert Pierrepoint, precise and calm, measured each of them the day before. Height, weight, drop length. Death, he believed, must come quickly. At 9:34 a.m., Irma Gries was led from her cell. She walked steadily, even smiling. When the white hood was placed over her head, she whispered in German, "Schnell." Quick. The trap door opened. She was 22 years old. Next came Elizabeth Falkenrath. She said nothing, no final words. Her eyes were distant, almost empty. Then Johanna Bormann. At 52, she needed help up the scaffold steps. As the rope was placed around her neck, she murmured, "I have my feelings." 3 lives, 3 endings. But it wasn't vengeance. It was the beginning of something larger. The executions of these women, among the only female war criminals hanged by Britain, shattered old assumptions. That cruelty wore only a man's face, that women could not commit atrocity, that evil needed a gun. It didn't. Sometimes it came with a nurse's smile, a dog's leash, a silence while others screamed. In the decades that followed, survivors of Bergen Belsen carried their memories like invisible scars. Some gave testimony, some never spoke again. The British bulldozed the camp, then burned it. Nothing remains of the original site, only grass, trees, and rows of simple stone markers. No names, just numbers. Here lie 5,000, here lie 800. And there is silence, a silence so complete it presses against the chest like grief. Visitors today walk through that quiet field, unaware that once it was filled with smoke and sickness and the sound of boots on broken ground. Justice, imperfect as it was, came to Belsen. But full reckoning? Perhaps it never will. Because how do you balance the scales against a mother who begged for milk for her dead child? Or the boy who lived just long enough to be freed, then died that night in a clean bed? The story of the Belsen guards does not end with their deaths. It lingers. In photos, in survivors' tears, in the soil that refused to forget. Some evils do not scream, they whisper, and they remain.